Okay, so welcome back to my channel, everybody. It's been since before the election in November since I've been on here. Um, so the election did not go as I expected. I expected the Democrats to get walloped. Polls showed that the election was tight. It didn't show the Republicans running away with it. Clearly, they took back the House, so it was good enough for them in that aspect. But I will say that the Republicans were still the biggest losers because, based on all the historical trends that were going on this year, they should have walked away with the election like they did in 2010 and then again in 2014, but they did not. It was abysmal for them. They barely took back the House in a year that was supposed to be bad for Democrats. I think they have at least a 5 seat majority, maybe a couple more. I'm not totally sure. But I think they have at least a 5 seat majority, which is the same as the Democrats had after the 2020 election. So that's not the greatest. And Kevin McCarthy, I do think he will ultimately be Speaker of the House, but he's got his homework cut out for him to get there because there are a lot of members on the right flank of his party that are threatening not to support him. If I were in Congress right now as a Republican, I would not be on his right flank, but I still wouldn't be supporting him either for different reasons. Uh, for different reasons from like someone like Andy Biggs. My reasons for not supporting Kevin McCarthy are far different than Andy Biggs's decisions and reasons. But I still would not be supporting him and would probably try to work with more moderate Republicans and Democrats to try to come up with maybe a less partisan speaker that wants to get stuff done, wants to negotiate deals. But anyway, so nevertheless, they were able to take back the House just barely, but they took it back. But the Democrats they picked up a seat in the Senate. So that's not very good for the Republicans. And the the Democrats, they picked up legislatures. They picked up Michigan legislature, and they've got control of Minnesota's now, as well as the governorships. They held on to uh, Wisconsin, the gubernatorial seat, and they flipped a chamber in the state House of Representatives, I believe, of Pennsylvania. Plus, picked up, at, held onto the governorship, with the gubernatorial candidate winning by like 14 points. I mean, they were smashing their margins in these swing states. It was amazing. But they ran really good candidates, though. They didn't run nut jobs. The Democrats have done really well, I think, at nominating good candidates for these swing districts. That's part of the reason why they didn't do so bad. Because they had to run against, and Democrats knew that they had to run against loonier Republicans than normal. A lot of these Trump acolytes that were running for office were not good fits for their state. They were not popular. They were not liked. They were, in fact, despised and somewhat feared. But I do want to highlight this one important part, and that in states where Republican candidates were really good, and I'm talking about conservative candidates, I'm not talking about some moderate like me. I'm not talking about a left wing Republican, even necessarily, a staunch conservative Republican that ran in some of these swing states or swing districts did phenomenal. Now, it was moderate candidates in New York that helped get the House back for the Republicans because the Republicans swept a lot of House seats in New York. They gerrymandered really bad in New York, but their state Supreme Court knocked down that gerrymandered map, much to their credit. And these were all Supreme Court justices appointed by Democrats. And they still They ruled on principle and the law over partisanship, which is amazing because if you know anything about New York, it's corrupt as sin. And in many ways, I mean, there's a reason why Andrew Cuomo was forced to resign because he was really sketchy. And I am concerned that he was pretty corrupt. Um, I don't know just how badly he was corrupt, and he seems to be bouncing back with the media career. He's starting a podcast or something. Last I heard, um, he probably would quibble with me over my opinions about him being corrupt, but I'm very suspicious of him. I don't trust him a whole lot, and that's his fault. That's not mine. But then the lieutenant governor stepped up to be governor, Kathy Hochul. She stepped up to be governor and had to appoint her successor to the lieutenant governor's seat. And that guy went down in flames too. He was previously a state senator from New York, the city of New York, to be clear. And yeah, he went down in flames too, and had to resign. I'm like, oh my god, these New Yorkers just can't cut any. They're not getting any slack from their politicians. They just got a bunch of idiots. And then, I mean, you have the Attorney General, Letitia James. I don't have a bunch of personal issues with her other than she ran for office on a platform of investigating Trump. And that is something like if he needs investigated, go ahead and investigate. But you set yourselves up for accusations and fair accusations of witch huntery for when you run for office saying, I'm going to investigate this, I'm going to investigate that. Well, what you're supposed to do as Attorney General is be a fair and impartial law enforcement officer, which is why it's a huge mistake why these people in New York are elected to that position anyways. They should be a politician. They should be appointed by a governor or something and sit in that seat for a number of years and then they're gone. I'd rather them be career professionals dedicated to law enforcement instead of being a politician, a lawyer who wanted to become a politician. I'm not really a fan of that. So while I don't hate her or anything, I do find legitimate criticism of her to be. I find quite a bit of criticism of her and to be legitimate to some degree. So New York is not necessarily in the best state of mind right now. So I go off on this little rant, I guess, about New York, but their Supreme Court held to the law and the Constitution of New York and struck down that gerrymandered map. Well, now they've got fair maps because of that in New York. And Republicans swept many of these seats because they nominated good candidates in these districts, and those candidates trounced Democrats. Well, I say trounced. They won by a couple points, but what I mean, they won. And I didn't know for sure if these seats were necessarily going to be winnable for Republicans or not. But elsewhere in the country, where nut jobs that were endorsed by Trump won, they lost miserably. They lost terribly in Minnesota and Wisconsin, except for Ron Johnson. He made it through, but Ron Johnson had also won originally in 2010 on his own right. It wasn't because of Donald Trump, even though Trump did support him. But in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, Colorado. Now, the Senate candidate in Colorado was really good, I thought. I probably would have voted for him. But the gubernatorial candidates, I'm not sure about them. But in Nevada and in Arizona, Trump-backed candidates lost pretty badly. Quite miserably, in fact. That being said, though, there is the incumbent governor, which is a Democrat in Nevada, did lose re-election to Republican sheriff of Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is. Joe Lombardo is the name. Steve Sisolak is the man who is the incumbent Democrat. His term is ending. He lost re-election. Now he's transitioning to the Republican named Joe Lombardo. He turned out to be a pretty good candidate for governor. And the people of Nevada punished the incumbent over the way he handled COVID, I believe. It really hurt a lot of people in Las Vegas, the shutdowns. And so Lombardo got to win off of that, and congratulations to him. Nevada's going to have a Republican governor, and I hope he does some well for the state. Now, the senatorial candidate, Adam Laxalt, I believe is his name, he actually was a pretty solid candidate for Senate as well, but he kind of started hewing towards the Trump message a little bit. I think that hurt him. If he had run as a more traditional conservative like what his grandfather was, he would have been okay. He probably would have knocked out Cortez Masto, the incumbent, Catherine Cortez Masto, the incumbent Democratic senator. But she won re-election, barely, but she won. She's pretty moderate, though. She's not a far left Democrat at all, to be honest with you. But then you look up towards Vermont and New Hampshire. Democratic candidate Jean Shaheen, I think was her name. I could be getting it wrong. I'm gonna look up New Hampshire senators. It might be the other one. Let's see here. It might not be. No, I'm sorry, Maggie Hassan. Jean Shaheen ran for re-election in 2020. It's Maggie Hassan. She won a re-election by 10 points, and she was considered a vulnerable Democrat, but she pulled it off. She beat out Kelly Ayotte, who won in 2010. Kelly Ayotte won her first election, beating out, I think, a Democrat in 2010 by a decent margin. But then, bless her heart, Kelly Ayotte, she lost re-election in 2016 by just barely. And Maggie Hassan beat her out. Maggie Hassan was a former sitting governor who was transitioning to a Senate career, and she lost Kelly Ayotte, who was a good Republican, I thought, very moderate down the middle, but yet conservative. Lost re-election. I don't know if people expected that or not. But then in 2022 is expected that if the incumbent governor, Chris Sununu, if he were to run for Senate, just like Maggie Hassan did, that he would beat her out because he won. Because in New Hampshire, the governor's reelected every 2 years. In Vermont and New Hampshire, they're reelected every 2 years. And so he won his first election in 2016, succeeding Maggie Hassan. Well, he's won every election by big margins. And so he's very popular. He's a conservative Republican, not right wing, extremely right wing, but very good Republican. I thought excellent, does well for business and all that stuff. Doing an excellent job governing the state of New Hampshire. It seems like very popular. They said if he were to run for Senate, he would have been the favorite to win. But instead, they got a guy who was a Trump acolyte, and the guy lost by 10 points, while the Republican governor won by like 20 or 30 points. He won by a pretty comfortable margin. So, Brian Kemp was not a Trump Republican. Now, bless his heart, he beat Trump going through the primary. So, Georgia Republicans did not fall to Trump very hard in 2022. So it was a pretty big defeat for Trump in Georgia when Kemp and Raffensperger and all them were reelected um, in their primaries. And then they went on to win the general election as well. And they won handily. I mean, Brian Kemp won by like 7 or 8 points in a state that's roughly half and half. And that's amazing. You know, he's showing he's a good candidate who can win and stuff. Um, so in states or districts where the Republicans had really good candidates that were fitting for their states, they trounced Democrats. But in states where they nominated idiots, just stupid, blithering idiots, Democrats trounced them. So had everybody at all these primaries that were normal conservatives, solid conservative Republicans had won their nominations, the Republican Party would have trounced this election like crazy. They would have won all over the place. Had people like me been on the ballot, so to speak, had I been on the ballot in Arizona, Katie Hobbs would not have won. Kari Lake was a strong candidate from the aspect of having a strong presence, knowing how to talk to people, reporters, cameras, supporters. Problem is she kept having this Trump message of this stolen 2020 election and how rigged it was, or she was a lot better about talking about it than Trump was because she knew how to word things better than Trump because she was a former news anchor, actually. She was nice looking, very beautiful lady, knew how to talk, very intelligent, but her message is what turned people off. Where had I been in that position, I would not be running with that message. I'd be running on actual issues. And I do believe in full confidence I could have trounced Maggie Hass, or not Maggie Hassan, she's in New Hampshire. Um, Katie Hobbs is what I'm trying to say. I would have trounced her because Katie Hobbs didn't want to debate. And that should have been one of the biggest flashing red lights because I was very nervous about Katie Hobbs losing. I was like, and this was back in like September. I remember I was listening to a podcast called PEP with Chaz and Dr. Dave. There are a couple of Australian guys that like to talk about American politics. And I learned more almost by listening to them and their 2-hour podcast than I learned from even American media, which I learn a lot from American media. Don't get me wrong, but I mean they go into deep depth and analysis on things, and Chaz Luchadello, the main host of that podcast, was expressing concern that Katie Hobbs wouldn't debate Kari Lake, and he said, "I'm going to be told you soing all over the place if Kari Lake wins because of that." And I remember I was standing on the beach of Miami. It was on Sunset Beach, I think. Sunny Isle Beach, excuse me. And I was just standing there watching the waves and listening to the podcast, just enjoying myself. And I remember when he said that, I was like, "Oh my God, that's 2 months. That's less than 2 months away. We could be losing Arizona to this lunatic." And lo and behold, she lost. Katie Hobbs did manage to win. Is because Kari Lake's message was so bad because she was so stuck to Trump and Trumpism that it turned people off. When just 4 years ago, the incumbent governor Doug Ducey won Arizona by like 14 points in a swing state, a state that's roughly half and half. Doug Ducey smashed that state to pieces on behalf of the Republicans in 2018. Also, the Democrats that year nominated a real doozy. Dear God, have mercy. They nominated a goofball. Bless his heart. He's a good looking chap, but he talked a lot about his frivolous lifestyle. and it made him look very unserious. It made him look like some college jock or something who's too busy partying. He looked too much and come across too much like a partier. I'm like, how did the Democrats nominate this idiot? So the Democrats do from time to time step in it really bad, but in this election, they barely got it over the line with Katie Hobbs. She was not a good candidate. She was not, but she managed to do good enough. So the Democrats didn't always score 100, but they certainly held off a big red wave that was coming, or that we thought was coming. Anyway, so I hope Republicans learn and do better. I think Ron DeSantis, he's a divisive candidate, but I do think he would be a little bit better than Trump. I do think he's got more decency within him. He's divisive, but he has his moments of decency that Trump didn't have too much of. So maybe they'll look to him as their standing bearer. I don't know. They'd be better off. I think the country, even for that matter, would be better off. I can disagree with Ron DeSantis, but Donald Trump scared me because he was so petulant and childish. But anyway, so that's all I've ranted. I can rant on for now. I've gone on for more than 21 minutes, and I hope everybody has a good rest of their Sunday, and God bless.